if you would turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Matthew 25. I'm going to turn there too, but I think I'm going to read out of the manuscript because the print's a little bigger. It's Matthew 25. And the idea here is that we published annual reports last Sunday, and in my report, I tapped into some ideas that I'm going to build upon today following the service, but the idea is that we need to give God our best. And when I was speaking of giving God our best, I wasn't saying that we need to be better than everyone else necessarily. I'm talking about taking the resources that we have, the resources that God has entrusted us with, and maximizing their use. That is to say, give God our best, make the most of the things that God has given us. And in that report, I referenced the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, verse 14 through 30. And so this morning I want to unpack that parable with you in more detail. So first we're going to read the parable, and then we're going to look at it in more detail. So just follow along with me, beginning in verse 14, where it says, "For it is just like a man who was about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately, the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he received the 1 talent, went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you have entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things, and I have put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Also, the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, 'Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents.' And his master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, what you have is yours.' But his master answered and said to him, 'You wicked and lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now, there's a lot going on in this parable, a lot. And we're probably not going to be able to grab every aspect of it because there is so much going on here. But in this parable, we're given a master who entrusts his resources to his servants before going on a long journey. And we see that he gave differing amounts of his resources to differing servants based upon their ability to manage it. One servant was given 5 talents, another 2, and another was only given 1 talent. And when he returned, he found that both the servant with 5 talents and the servant with 2 invested what they had given, and they returned with double of what they were initially given. However, the servant who was entrusted with only 1 talent buried what he had in the ground, rather than investing it. So he returned back only what had been given to him initially and nothing more. And the master responded by praising the first 2 servants. And note that he praised them equally, even though technically one brought back far more than the other. And so if you look in the text, it's verse 21 where he says, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." He said that to the one with 10 talents, the one who was initially given 5 and then made 5 more out of them. But he says in verse 23, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." The exact same words were said to the servant with 4 talents who had initially received 2 and doubled them. So the idea here is that they were affirmed for making the most of what was given to them, not the amount that they had. Do you see it there? They were affirmed because they took what God gave them and multiplied it. They made the most of it, and that's why they were affirmed, not based upon who had more. And with this in mind, if the servant with 1 talent had done the same thing as the other 2, if he had invested the talent was given to him and made the most of it, then he would have received the exact same affirmation as the other, despite the fact he would have had the least amount. Does that make sense? He would have only had 2 in the end if he had done the same as the other, but he would have gotten the same affirmation because he would have made the most with the talent that he had. Unfortunately, he did not invest it, and that was the cause of his condemnation. In other words, for the sake of our theme this morning, we can put it this way. The first 2 servants were affirmed because they gave the master their best, and the last was condemned for his failure to do so. The first 2 were affirmed for their ability or their willingness to make the most of what God had given them, and the latter was condemned for his failure to do so. And what I want to unpack with the few minutes remaining is why. And as we peel back the layers on this, I want to ask the question of why did the servant with 1 talent choose differently than the other 2? And what can we learn from this that will help us to make the most of what we have? What can we learn from this that will help us to give God our best today? And I would argue that there are 2 main reasons that the servant with 1 talent made different choices from the other 2. There's 2 main reasons that the text gives us, again, that the servant with 1 talent chose differently. And the first is this. The first 2 servants understood the value of what they'd been entrusted with, the other did not. Again, the first 2 servants understood the value of what they'd been entrusted with, and the other did not. All right? The text is clear that all 3 servants were entrusted with portions of their master's wealth. All 3 of them were. We see that in verse 14, in the very beginning of the passage. It says, "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them." All right? We know from the next verse, in verse 15, that they were all assigned differing portions of the master's wealth. However, what is the same across the board with all 3 is that what they had been entrusted with, whether it was a large portion or a small portion, was the master's wealth. And its value was more about what it was than about how much of it they had in their possession. All 3 of them had the master's wealth. And when we're looking at this parable, what we realize is the value of the master's wealth was more about what it was than how much of it they had. It was about the fact that it was the master's wealth in their possession than how much of it they had. Now, I think it's safe to say here that the servant with the 1 talent got mixed up on this. And I think it's understandable. I think that this is something we can appreciate, but this is why he failed, or at least it's part of why he failed. And what I mean to say here is that the servant with 1 talent most likely viewed what the servant with 5 talents had as far more valuable than his share. And he would also look over at what the servant with 2, with the servant that had twice as much as him, and said, "This guy has way more than what I have. It's more valuable." And if we're honest with ourselves, we would have to admit that this logic kind of makes sense in this world. Stop and think of it this way: if one person has in their hand 5 1-carat diamonds, and another has 1 1-carat diamond, we would probably look at the person with the 5 and say their treasure is more valuable than the person with the 1, right? We would do that. However, in God's economy, it isn't always that simple, and that's the issue that the servant with 1 talent was having here. He looked at the person with 5 talents and said, "You have more value than I do because I only have 1. You have 5 times as much as me." In God's economy, it doesn't work that way. In God's economy, value is often just as much about what it is as it is how much of it there is. And I'll give you a classic example of this, and that would be human life. All right? What's more valuable, 1 human life or 10 human lives? You know, which one's more valuable? It's harder to answer that question, isn't it? And that's why when we're put with these moral and ethical dilemmas, like, you got a runaway trolley going down the tracks, and you got a lever in front of you, and if you don't pull the lever, it's going to crash into a building and take out, 100 people. But if you do pull the lever, it's just going to go off a cliff, and it's going to only take out the 10 people that are inside. What is the right choice? Is it 100 people or 10 people? Which way do you pull the lever? Moral and ethical dilemmas like that are stressful for a reason, because intrinsically we know that human life is more than, its value is more than just about how many there is. If it was just about how many there was, the choice would be easy. It's not, because intrinsic value is in human life itself. The value of human life is as much about what it is as it is about how much of it we're dealing with. And in God's kingdom, it's kind of the same way. It's more about what it is than about how much of it there is. And with this in mind, part of the reason the servant with only one talent made the wrong choice here is because he was assessing the value of his stewardship more upon how little he had in comparison to the others than what he actually had, which was the exact same thing as them. And to put it another way, all of them, whether they had 5 talents, 2 talents, or 1 talent, possessed the master's wealth. That was what was important, was that they had in their hands, whether a big share or a small share, they had a piece of the king's treasure. That's what mattered. Now, how does this work practically today? Right now, in this building today, is Christ Church, is it not? We are Christ Church. I think it's safe to say we are a relatively small slice of the pie, are we not? It's a sliver, it's a small piece of the pie. But does that make us any less Christ Church right here today? We are Christ Church just as much as a church of 2,000 people is Christ Church, all right? And we need to ask ourselves the question, do we assess the value of this church based upon what it is or how much of it we have? All right, we have to ask that question. Do we focus on growing and investing what we have and making it the most that it can possibly be, or do we look mournfully at the size of ours versus everyone else's? We need to keep in mind that we can do the same thing that the servant with 1 talent did. If we're not careful, we can say, oh, I don't really have as much, so it's not as valuable. The truth of the matter is what we have is equally as valuable as the largest church in the world. It really is, because what is here is Christ Church. And for that reason alone, for the reason that it's Christ Church, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the King of the universe to invest ourselves in it and make it the most it can possibly be. For that reason alone. Does that make sense? Do you see how this works? We are Christ Church. We must give God our best. And the first step in doing so is recognizing that our value is based upon what we are and not how big or small we are. And the first 2 servants acted based upon the intrinsic value of their stewardship. They acted because of what they had, not how much of it they had. And that is why their outcome was the same, even though the size of their share was different. The last servant acted based upon the size of his share, not its intrinsic value. And that's why his outcome was so dramatically different from the other 2. And the lesson to learn here, if we were to summarize this lesson, is this. In order to give God our best, we must first appreciate the value of what God has given. In order to give God our best, we must appreciate the value of what God has given. If what God has given us isn't enough, if we're not satisfied with it, then we're not going to give our best with it, all right? In the same way, I'm dumbing the example down, but in the same way, when you're at a job working with someone who hates their job, they don't give it their best because they don't appreciate what they have. I'm not trying to overstate this. I get there's bad jobs out there, but if you don't appreciate what you have, you don't apply yourself. It is as simple as that. Make sense? So I'll let you get that down. And I hear your thoughts. I hear you all saying, if you would just provide an outline, I wouldn't have to write as long. I hear you. I promise you I'm working on that, okay? I have minimal time and I have to invest it the best way I can. Printed outlines are coming, okay? I promise you in 2 years. Yeah, I don't know, just joking. Anyway, moving on. There's a second reason to unpack here, and that is that the first 2 servants understood the purpose for what they've been entrusted with as well. They understood the value of it, but they also understood the purpose for it, and that's the other reason they succeeded where the other failed. The servant with 1 talent buried his portion of his master's wealth in the ground, rather than investing it as the other two did. In other words, he prioritized protecting his master's wealth above all else, rather than exposing it to some risk, some limited risk, with the potential to gain more. He prioritized the first one, the servant with one talent protected it, focused on protecting it. The other two focused on investing it. There's differences there, it's huge. And the text gives us the reason that the servant with one talent made this decision. We see it in verses 24 and 25. I'll read it to you now. And the one also who had received the one talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent on the ground. See, what you have is yours. In other words, he said, I feared you and how you might respond if something happened to your wealth. So I played it safe and I buried it in the ground. That's what he said. I feared your response, I played it safe. What does this mean? It means that the servant with one talent didn't deploy his master's wealth the way his master wanted him to. That's what it means. It means that the servant with one talent didn't deploy the wealth was given to him the way the master wanted him to use it. And the reason he made this mistake is because he didn't really know his master. He didn't really understand his master. He didn't understand what his master wanted. He didn't understand his heart. He didn't understand his desire. And we see this in the description that he gave of him. Looking back in verse 25, this overlaps into 24 and 25, he describes his master this way. I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. In other words, how's he describing him? He's describing him as a tyrant. I knew you to be a hard man, an austere man. You take what's not yours. You scatter. You take things that don't belong to you. He's describing him as a tyrant, all right? And that's why he was afraid of him. That's indication right there. And people point this out all the time. That servant didn't really know him, didn't understand him, had a distorted view of him, all right? Now, believe it or not, I see this principle play out at work. Yes, here we go again with a work example. But it does. This happens to be a pretty good one. I see this principle play out all the time at work, and so I'm going to just give you a couple examples of how it works here, dumbing it down, taking kingdom principles and dumbing it down into grocery store talk for just a second, okay? Just recently, maybe about a week and a half ago, I was called over to deal with a woman who was at the cash register contesting and arguing with a coordinator over a package of rolls, all right? Yes, see, we're dumbing it right down into grocery store talk here. She was arguing over the price of some rolls she wanted to buy. And she was arguing because on the rolls in the commercial bread department, they take a pricing gun, an old school pricing gun, and they put the expiration date on the rolls. So, I think there was like a 225 on there or something like that. That 225 was supposed to say they expire on February 25th. But whoever put that expiration date on there forgot to pull the plus tax off of the pricing gun, and so it said 225 plus tax. And so it was supposed to be an expiration date, but it said 225 plus tax. And so she's like, wait a minute here, it says 225 on it, I want it for 225. And this coordinator was just going, oh, that's an expiration date, that's not what they're for, blah, blah, And they were back and forth wrangling, and so they called the manager, and I come over there, and the coordinator explains to me, this person will not listen to reason here, blah, 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 blah. And I took one look at it, and I said, give her the price. Didn't even bat an eyelash, just gave it to her. And I said to her, basically, this coordinator is correct. This is an expiration date. However, I can see where you're coming from, so we'll give it to you this time, and next time, you'll pay full price. Sound fair? Sure. Smile on their face, left whistling. The coordinator was so irritated with me at the end of that. He says, why'd you do that? She's scamming us. She's probably knew the whole while. I says, maybe, but this is how Danny would want me to spend his money. That's what I told her. Every time I come up against these things, I hear what you're saying, but this is how the owner of the company would want me to spend the money. So that's what I'm going to do. It's his money, not my money. This is how he would want it spent. You're trying to spend it your way. My job is to spend it his way. Make sense? Another example. This happened just a couple days ago. A guy came up to the register and he had a cheesecake. And it was one of the, yeah, thank you. It was one of those, with the cherries on top too. And speaking of the toppings and stuff, it was in one of those cases, those clear cases, and it got tipped over. And so the cake slid and the toppings kind of smashed up into the top. You ever seen when that happens? And so the toppings are still in there, but they're stuck to the top. You're like, oh, it doesn't look very good anymore. I don't, and so the cashier saw it. They flashed a light, and then they brought a coordinator over, and they tried to get this guy another cake. But alas, it was the evening, and there was no more cherry cheesecakes left. So he had the last one, and it had been damaged. And the guy really wanted this cheesecake. I think he was supposed to, I think his wife wanted to bring it home for a dessert or something like that. You know, I don't know what was going on. He's like, I guess I just gotta take it as it is. And he was getting ready to pull his wallet out and pay for it. Well, I had just been called up, and I saw what was happening, and I said, take it for free. Just like that. Take the, and one of the coordinators says, that cake is $16. I said, yep, he's getting it for free. He was like, well, really? I was like, yeah. And I gave it to him for free. And he had the biggest smile on his face. He thanked me. I said, we're sorry that it happened. We'll get it right next time. And he thanked me profusely, stuff like that. And once again, they all looked at me and said, you just gave away $16. I said, yep, that's the way Danny would have wanted me to spend that money. It's as simple as that. Make sense? It's not my money. It's his money. And my job is to spend it Danny's way. Now, I have watched over and over again new trainees and managers come over like that first coordinator and wrangle with people over peanuts, cents, $1 or $2 here or that. And they do this because they don't understand the way that the owners want them to spend their money. They're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of doing something wrong. And so they wrangle and fight with customers and alienate them over peanuts and nonsense. And then I walk over and I give it to them, and they get irritated. And I remind them that what you're doing isn't the way he wants it done. And my point behind this example is that God has given us his treasure, and he wants us to deploy it boldly. He wants us to spend it the way he wants it spent. And oftentimes, that involves taking risks and even making a few mistakes along the way. But he still wants us to be active in investing ourselves. God doesn't get mad at us for trying and failing. He gets mad when we refuse to try for fear of failing. And what you're looking at with that servant with one talent is someone who was afraid of doing the wrong thing, and so he buried the money in the ground, and he did nothing with it, when in fact what the master ultimately wanted was for him to take risks, to go out and invest it, and to be bold. And the lesson here, of course, is what I've already said, is that in order to give God our best, we must know him personally. We must understand his heart. And that is how we learn to deploy his treasure. All right? We saw in the example in the text, he didn't know his master. He had this view of him like he was going to bite his head off if he made a mistake, and that caused him to bury it in the ground. And the reason I gave you the Wegmans example is because I watched these guys wrangle over $1.50, alienating customers and stuff like that. They're afraid that if they make a mistake, they're afraid if they give away a penny the wrong way, that someone's going to bite their heads off. And they don't understand that the actual owners of the company are generous and want it spent a different way. And if they just understood the owners, they would do it differently. Same thing is true with the kingdom of God. If we understand God, we understand his heart, we understand that the treasure he's given us, small or large, is designed to be deployed and to given boldly, aggressively, fearlessly. Yes, we'll make mistakes, but God won't get mad at us if we make a mistake once in a while. He just wants us to get out there and use it. He wants us to boldly extend grace. Now, how do we boldly extend in this particular case? We can talk about that a little bit next time. But isn't it interesting that and when you look at the parable itself, it concludes with language that seems to indicate that the servant with one talent it's hell language. Have you noticed that? Take this wicked servant. He calls him wicked. He calls him lazy. He says, cast him into outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You read language like that, and it's scary. And if you read this at the base level, it looks very performance-based. Like if you read it the wrong way, you're going to get kind of a gun to your head kind of an idea, where if I don't produce, then he's going to cast me out. But again, that's not the idea. The idea is that this person didn't produce, this person behaved this completely opposite way from the other two, because ultimately, he didn't know the master. He didn't know him. He had completely no clue what he was like. That's why he said, I knew you to be a hard and austere man and take things from people that don't belong to him. That's because he didn't know him. He didn't understand him. He feared him, but he didn't know him. All right? And that's why he behaved that way. And the same thing is true for us. Salvation is about knowing God. Salvation is about having faith and believing in him, not about doing for him. However, if we know God, if we understand what he's really like, if we understand his heart and his love for the whole world, we will produce for him out of love and out of joy and out of an awareness of the treasure that we have. Does that make sense? So when you take it out there, introduce them to God, introduce them to what he's like through your own behavior, and be aware that what we have right here in this room is huge because it is the master's treasure, and we have a responsibility to take it out. And we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes, but for now, will you just pray with me?